Grace Evans stood alone in the back room of Eveline's bridal boutique, her fingers trembling as they brushed the lace of a wedding dress she'd poured her soul into. The shop was quiet, a small haven tucked into Brooklyn's busy streets, its walls lined with white gowns that glowed faintly under golden lights. It was late, the kind of evening where the city outside softened to a hum, leaving Grace with her thoughts and her needle. She was 27, her hazel eyes tired from a long day, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, her apron streaked with thread and dust. She didn't know it yet, but tonight would unravel everything she'd kept hidden. Across town, Lucas Bennett cut through New York's chaos with the ease of a man who owned it. At 34, he was the CEO of Bennett Luxury, a fashion empire built on precision and power. His dark hair was slicked back, his blue eyes sharp and cold, a figure who dominated boardrooms and dismissed distractions without a second thought. He was on a mission, chasing a tip about a rival's fabric shipment, his mind locked on business. His driver dropped him at what he thought was a warehouse, but the faded sign above the door read, Evelyn's Bridal Boutique. He didn't pause to check. He pushed inside, expecting rolls of satin, not the sight that would stop his heart. In the cramped back room, Grace slipped out of her worn jeans and faded shirt, the air cool against her skin. She'd been working on this dress for months, a secret she'd stitched in stolen hours. It was pure white, its bodice blooming with hand-sewn roses, its train flowing like a quiet stream. She'd used a discarded bolt of ivory silk, too flawed for Evelyn to sell, and turned it into something extraordinary. Tonight, she wanted to see it whole, to feel it against her. She pulled it on, the fabric whispering as it settled, and turned to the cracked mirror. For a moment, she let herself smile, her reflection glowing with a pride she rarely allowed. Then the door flew open. Lucas stepped in, phone pressed to his ear, voice clipped as he barked orders about deadlines. He froze, the words dying on his lips. There she stood, Grace, bathed in the dim glow of a single bulb, the dress hugging her like it was alive. Her hair spilled loose, her bare shoulders catching the light, her wide eyes snapping to his in shock. She wasn't polished or posed, just a woman caught raw, and to Lucas, she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. His phone slipped, crashing to the floor with a sharp clatter. She's a vision, he breathed, the sound barely escaping his throat. Grace spun around, her heart slamming into her ribs. Who are you? Get out now, she shouted, her voice slicing through the silence. She lunged for the curtain, yanking it across the doorway, but it jammed, leaving her half exposed, her face flaming red. Lucas stumbled back, hands up. I thought this was... His usual control shattered, his eyes locked on her, unable to pull away. Grace's hands clutched the dress, her mind racing. Who was this man, all sharp suit and sharper stare, gaping at her like she'd fallen from the sky? Out, she yelled again, her tone fierce. No. The room erupted. Lucas fumbled for his phone, muttering, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, but his gaze kept darting back, drawn to her like a magnet. The curtain gave way, collapsing to the floor, and Grace ducked behind it, her breath ragged. What kind of lunatic barges in here? She snapped, her voice muffled but furious. Lucas, still off balance, called through the fabric. I didn't know anyone was here, I swear, but that dress... Did you make it? Grace peeked out, her glare cutting. What? Yes, but that's none of your business. Get out. Lucas didn't budge. Something held him there. A pull he couldn't name. It's extraordinary, he said, his voice dropping low, almost reverent. You're extraordinary. Grace blinked, her anger stumbling over his words. You've got no right to be here, she shot back, but her hands shook, pride flickering beneath her embarrassment. This wasn't supposed to happen. No one was meant to see this dress, her private escape, least of all a stranger who looked at her like she was a treasure. Lucas took a step closer, his mind racing. He'd walked in expecting fabric rolls, not a woman who'd just turned his world upside down. I'm Lucas Bennett, he said finally, his tone softening. I run Bennett Luxury, and you're not what I expected tonight. Grace narrowed her eyes, her pulse still pounding. I don't care who you are, you need to leave. But there was a crack in her voice, a waver Lucas caught. He stepped back, forcing himself to break the spell. "I'll go," he said, though every instinct screamed to stay. "But I'll be back. Someone like you doesn't belong in a place like this." He turned, vanishing into the night, leaving Grace staring after him, her heart thumping for reasons she couldn't grasp. She sank to the floor, the dress pooling around her, her breath uneven. "What just happened?" she whispered, her fingers brushing the lace. She'd spent years hiding, stitching other people's dreams, and now this man had seen her, really seen her, in a way that shook her to her core. Outside, Lucas leaned against his car, the cold air doing nothing to calm him. Her image burned in his mind, those eyes, that dress, that fire. He'd fallen, hard in a single glance, and he didn't even know her name. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a collision, a spark igniting something neither of them could stop. Grace wanted to forget him, to shove this moment back into the shadows where she lived, but Lucas wasn't the type to let go. He'd seen beauty before, but nothing like her, and he was already plotting his next move. Their worlds had crashed together, and the pieces were about to fall in ways they'd never expect. The morning after Lucas Bennett stormed out of Evelyn's bridal boutique, Grace Evans couldn't shake the echo of his voice. She stood behind the shop's counter, her needle jabbing into a hem with more force than needed, her mind replaying the chaos of last night. That man, all polished suit and piercing eyes, had seen her in a way no one ever had, and it left her rattled. The dress, her secret, her sanctuary, wasn't secret anymore. She wanted to forget him, to stitch herself back into the quiet life she knew. But the universe had other plans. Lucas barely slept. He paced his Manhattan penthouse, the city skyline a blur beyond his windows, his thoughts trapped in that dim back room. Grace's image haunted him, her fury, her beauty, the way that dress turned her into something untouchable yet real. He was convinced she wasn't just a seamstress. No one could craft like that and stay hidden unless someone was keeping her under wraps. He pegged her as a talent his rivals at Luxe Atelier were grooming in secret, and he wasn't about to let them win. By 10, he was back in Brooklyn, stepping into the boutique with a bouquet of white roses, his black suit stark against the shop's worn charm. Grace looked up from her work, and her stomach twisted. There he was again, filling the doorway, flowers in hand like some knight from a story she didn't belong in. "You," she said, her voice sharp, dropping her needle with a clink. "What do you want now, to barge in again?" Lucas crossed the room, unfazed, laying the roses on the counter between them. "I came to apologize," he said, his tones smooth but edged with purpose. "Last night was a mistake. I didn't mean to intrude, but I can't stop thinking about that dress, about you." Heat crept up Grace's neck, her hazel eyes narrowing. "It's just a dress," she muttered, shoving the roses aside. "And I'm just a seamstress. You've got the wrong person." Lucas leaned in, his blue gaze locking onto hers, steady and intense. "No," he said, his voice low. "I don't think so. That wasn't some ordinary gown. It was art. Your art. And I want you to work for me." Grace stared, her breath catching at the absurdity. "Work for you? I don't even know you." He slid a business card across the counter, gold letters glinting under the shop's weak light. Lucas Bennett, CEO, Bennett Luxury. "I run a fashion empire," he said, his words calm but commanding. "And I need someone like you. Come design for me. I'll pay you 10 times what you make here." Grace let out a laugh, short and bitter. "You think I'm for sale? I'm not one of your runway girls. I fix hems. I don't belong in your world." Lucas didn't flinch, his eyes tracing her face. "You don't belong here either," he said, glancing at the cracked counter, the sagging racks. "A place like this can't hold what you've got." That hit her hard. Grace clenched her fists, her voice rising. "You don't know me. You saw me for 5 seconds and think you've got it all figured out? I'm not your project." Lucas tilted his head, studying her, and something softened in his stare, a flicker of wonder breaking through his usual steel. 5 seconds was enough," he said quietly. I've seen hundreds of designers, none of them stopped me like you did. Grace faltered, her anger tripping over the weight of his words. She wanted to shove him out, to slam the door on this madness, but that look in his eyes pinned her in place. Lucas didn't buy her resistance. He was sure she was holding back, a star playing small for reasons he'd uncover. He didn't know the truth. That dress was Grace's private rebellion, a dream she'd never shared, not a stepping stone to fame. Think about it, he said, stepping back, his voice firm. You've got until tomorrow. Call me. He left the card, the roses, and a silence that swallowed the room. Grace watched him go, her fingers brushing the card against her will. She hated how his offer stirred her, how it reached into the part of her she'd locked away. Alone again, Grace picked up her needle, but her hands wouldn't steady. She'd spent years convincing herself this was enough, mending gowns for strangers, burying her sketches where no one could find them. Lucas had seen through that in an instant, and it scared her. He's wrong, she whispered to the empty shop, her voice thin. I'm not that girl. But a small, stubborn part of her wondered what it'd be like to say yes, to step into the light he seemed so sure she deserved. Across the city, Lucas drove back to his tower, his mind buzzing. He wasn't just chasing a designer. He was chasing her, and he couldn't stop. Their worlds were tangling fast, built on a misunderstanding that would pull them closer than either could predict. Grace wanted to run from his offer, to stay safe in her shadows, but Lucas had already decided she was his next victory, and he wasn't the type to lose. Grace Evans couldn't focus after Lucas Bennett left the boutique, his business card burning a hole in her pocket. She stood behind the counter, her needle slipping through the fabric, pricking her finger until a drop of blood stained the hem she was supposed to finish. She cursed quietly, shoving the card deeper out of sight, but his words echoed louder than the hum of Brooklyn outside. Your art, he'd said, and it rattled her more than she'd admit. She wanted to forget him, to bury last night's chaos and this morning's madness. But her hands wouldn't steady, and her mind kept drifting back to a life she'd tried to keep small. She'd grown up in a cramped apartment in Queens, a place where the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors fight, and the radiator clanked like a tired heartbeat. Her mother had been a seamstress, her hands rough from years of mending, her hazel eyes soft as she taught Grace to thread a needle before she could read. Money was a ghost in their home, always slipping away, with her dad hauling trash at dawn to chase it. Grace was 10 when her mom's cough turned into something darker, a shadow that took her 2 years later. Her last words stuck like thread in Grace's memory. Make something beautiful, Gracie. It'll carry you through. Her grandmother came after that, a wiry woman with a sharp tongue and a sewing machine that groaned with age. She turned Grace's grief into skill, showing her how to stitch scraps into skirts, how to dream a dress before it took shape. By 16, Grace was sketching gowns in her schoolbooks, wedding dresses mostly, all lace and light, escapes she drew while the world pressed in. She wasn't loud or bold, just a quiet girl with a pencil and a hope she kept to herself. But life didn't care about hopes. Her dad's back gave out when she was 20, his body breaking under the weight of years, and college turned into a bill they couldn't face. Grace went to work instead. She found Evelyn's Bridal Boutique, a dusty shop run by a woman who saw her as cheap labor, not talent. She started sweeping floors, then fixing hems, mending veils, and patching bodices for brides who twirled past her without a glance. It kept the rent paid, kept her dad's medicine on the shelf, but it hollowed her out. She'd watch those women glow in dresses she'd saved, their joy a light she couldn't touch. At night, she'd trudge home to that creaky apartment, her dad asleep in his chair, and pull a wooden box from under her bed. Inside were her sketches, dozens of them, gowns born from sleepless hours, each one a piece of a life she didn't dare chase. The dress Lucas saw was different. She'd started it a year ago after a bride left behind a bolt of ivory silk, too flawed for Evelyn's profit but perfect for Grace's hands. She'd taken it home, worked on it in the dark, stitching roses into the bodice with thread she'd saved, letting the train spill like a river across her floor. It wasn't for anyone else, just for her. a quiet rebellion against a world that kept her down. Sometimes, late at night, she'd slip it on, standing in front of her cracked bedroom mirror, pretending she was someone who mattered. She'd never meant for it to leave that room, never meant for a man like Lucas to crash in and see it. Now, in the shop, the day dragged on, and Grace's thoughts wouldn't settle. She'd spent years telling herself this was enough, stitching other people's dreams while hers gathered dust. Lucas had seen through that in a heartbeat, and it scared her. She pulled his card out, staring at the gold letters. Lucas Bennett, CEO, Bennett Luxury. 10 times what I make, he'd said like it was nothing. It could pay her dad's debts, move him somewhere with clean air, give her a breath she hadn't taken in years. But work for him? A man who looked at her like she was a prize to win? She wasn't ready to be pulled from her shadows. Her mind slid back to his voice, cutting through her panic last night. That dress is art. Your art. No one had ever said that, not her dad, not Evelyn, not even herself. She'd always been the girl who faded, who fixed things and stepped back. Lucas didn't see that girl. He saw someone else, someone she'd buried under duty and fear. She traced the card's edge, her thumb lingering. He's wrong, she whispered to the empty shop, her voice barely there. Not that person, but a small, stubborn part of her wondered what it'd be like to step into his world, to let someone see her for once. Grace's life had been a tight knot, woven from survival and sacrifice. She'd never left Queens, never shown her sketches to a soul, never let herself want more. That dress was her scream, her one act of defiance, and now Lucas had torn it open. She didn't know it yet, but he was shaken too. Across the city, Lucas sat in his office, a blank sketchpad on his desk, trying to capture what he'd seen in her. He'd built an empire on control, but Grace had undone him in a single glance, and he couldn't let it go. Their collision wasn't just chance. It was a thread pulling tight, a stitch about to unravel everything. Grace wanted to stay hidden, to keep her world small and safe. But Lucas had already decided she was more, and he was coming back for her. Grace Evans spent the next few days trying to push Lucas Bennett out of her mind, but his card stayed in her pocket, a quiet weight she couldn't ignore. The shop hummed around her, brides flitting in and out, their laughter a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. She'd stitched her way through another morning when Evelyn called her to the back, her voice sharp. "Rent's due, and we're short," the older woman said, her eyes narrow. "If we don't get a big order soon, this place is done." Grace's stomach sank. She thought of her dad, the pills he needed, the apartment they could lose. Lucas's offer flashed like a lifeline, 10 times her pay. A chance to breathe. She hated it, but she couldn't say no. That afternoon, she stood outside Bennett Luxury's towering headquarters in Manhattan, the glass and steel gleaming under a gray sky. Her faded jacket and scuffed boots felt out of place among the sleek suits rushing past. She clutched his card, her hands clammy, and forced herself inside. The lobby was a world apart, marble floors echoing her steps, a chandelier dripping light like liquid gold. Lucas met her at the elevator, his black suit crisp, his blue eyes lighting up when he saw her. "You came," he said, his voice warm with something she couldn't place. "I knew you would." Grace squared her shoulders. "I'm here for the job, not for you," she said, her tone firm. "Let's get that straight." He led her to the top floor, a sprawling office with views that swallowed the city whole. Sketches and fabric swatches lined the walls, a chaos of creativity she'd only dreamed of. "I need a new bridal collection," Lucas said, leaning against his desk. "Something fresh, something real. You start today." Grace blinked, her heart racing. "Today? I've never done this before, not like this." Lucas smiled, a rare crack in his usual steel. "You've got it in you. I saw it that night. Show me what you can do." He handed her a sketchpad, his fingers brushing hers, and a jolt ran through her she couldn't shake. Grace threw herself into it, her pencil flying across the page, roses blooming in ink, trains spilling like rivers. Lucas watched her, his gaze steady, and she felt it, a heat she didn't want to name. Days turned into weeks, and the office became her battleground. She'd sketch late into the night, fabrics piling around her, her hands stained with chalk. Lucas was there too, bringing coffee, hovering close, his voice low as he praised her work. "This is what I saw in you," he'd say, and she'd look away, her pulse quickening. She didn't want to like it, didn't want to like him, but he was wearing her down. Trouble came fast. Lucas's team didn't take to her, a scrappy seamstress from Queens stepping into their polished world. One afternoon, she overheard them in the break room, their voices cutting through the door. "She's just his pet project," a designer named Claire sneered, her red nails tapping a mug. "Some nobody he found in a dump. She's got no training, no class." Another chimed in. "He's only keeping her around because she's a pretty face." Grace froze, her sketchpad slipping in her hands. The words hit like needles, piercing the fragile hope she'd started to build. She wasn't one of them. She never would be. She stormed out, her chest tight, and found Lucas in his office. "I'm done," she said, slamming the sketchpad on his desk. "I don't belong here. Your people think I'm a joke, and maybe they're right. I'm not your charity case." Lucas stood, his jaw tight. "Who said that?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "It doesn't matter," Grace shot back. "They're not wrong. I'm a seamstress, not a designer. I shouldn't have come." She turned to go, but Lucas caught her wrist, his grip firm but not rough. "Wait," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "You're not leaving." Grace pulled free, her voice rising. "You don't get it, do you? I'm not your project to fix. I don't need you or your fancy job." Lucas stepped closer, his presence filling the room. "This isn't about fixing you," he said, his tone low and fierce. "It's about believing in you. I saw something that night, something real, and I'm not letting you walk away because of a few jealous fools." Grace stared at him, her anger tangling with something softer. His eyes held hers, steady and sure, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. "You don't know me," she said, quieter now, her resolve cracking. "You saw me in a dress and made up some story about who I am." Lucas shook his head, his voice dropping. "I saw you, Grace, not the dress. You." Her breath caught, his words sinking deep. She wanted to argue, to run, but his certainty held her there. He stepped back, giving her space, but his gaze didn't waver. "Stay," he said. "Prove them wrong. Prove it to yourself." Grace didn't answer. She grabbed her sketchpad and left, her heart pounding as she hit the street. The cold air bit her cheeks, but it couldn't chase away the heat of his touch, the weight of his belief. She'd come for the money, for her dad, but now it was more. Lucas saw her in a way no one ever had, and it terrified her. She didn't want to need him, didn't want to feel this pull, but it was there, growing stronger. Back in his office, Lucas sank into his chair, staring at the spot where she'd stood. He had built his life on control, on winning, but Grace was different. She wasn't a deal to close or a rival to crush. She was a fire he couldn't tame, and he was already in too deep. He'd fight for her, not just for her talent, but for the way she made him feel alive again. Their clash had lit a spark, and it wasn't burning out anytime soon. Grace wanted to retreat, to hide in the life she knew, but Lucas wasn't letting go, and the world he'd pulled her into was about to test them both. Grace Evans walked away from Lucas Bennett's office with her sketchpad clutched tight, the Manhattan streets blurring around her as she fought to steady her breath. His words clung to her. "I saw you, Grace, not the dress." And they stirred a storm she couldn't quiet. She'd stayed at Bennett Luxury despite the whispers, sketching gowns that poured out of her like a river breaking free, but the clash with his team had cracked something open. She wanted to prove them wrong, to prove Lucas right, but doubt gnawed at her. She didn't know how close she was to a truth that would shake them both. Lucas watched her go from his window, the city sprawling below, his hands clenched at his sides. He'd meant every word, but seeing her walk out cut deeper than he'd expected. She wasn't just a designer to him anymore, not just a spark from that night in the boutique. She was unraveling him piece by piece, and he couldn't stop it. He turned back to her latest sketch, roses blooming across the page, and froze. Something about it tugged at a memory, a shadow from years ago he couldn't place. He pulled out his phone, dialing his assistant. "Get me everything on that dress from the boutique, now." Days later, Grace sat in the atelier, surrounded by fabric and silence, her pencil tracing a new design. Lucas walked in, his face tight, holding a photograph. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but urgent. He set the photo on the table, a faded image of a wedding dress, its bodice stitched with roses, its train flowing like a dream. Grace's breath caught. It was so close to hers. Too close. "What is this?" she asked, her hands trembling. Lucas's eyes locked onto hers, sharp with something she didn't recognize. "It's my mother's last design, Eleanor Bennett. She made it before she died 10 years ago. Tell me, Grace, where did you get your idea?" Grace stared, her mind reeling. "I didn't get it anywhere," she said, her voice rising. "I made it up. It's mine." Lucas stepped closer, his jaw tight. "This isn't a coincidence. The roses, the cut, it's identical. Did someone show you this? Did you take it?" His words hit like a slap, and Grace shot to her feet, her sketchpad clattering to the floor. "Take it? You think I'm a thief? I've never seen this before in my life." Her chest heaved, anger and hurt tangling together. Lucas didn't back down. "Then explain it," he said, his tone hard, "because this doesn't just happen." The air between them crackled, thick with accusation and confusion. Grace wanted to run, to escape the weight of his stare, but she stood her ground. "I don't owe you an explanation," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't owe you anything." She grabbed her bag, ready to leave, but Lucas blocked the door. "Wait," he said, softer now, his hand hovering near her arm. "I need to understand this. It's not just about the dress. It's about her." Grace paused, catching the break in his voice, the pain behind his steel. "Your mother?" she asked, quieter. He nodded, looking away. "She was everything to me. And that design, it was her heart." Grace's anger faltered, replaced by a flicker of something softer. She didn't have answers, but she saw the crack in him, a man who'd built walls she was starting to climb. Before she could speak, the door swung open, and Olivia Bennett strode in, Lucas's older sister, her dark hair pulled tight, her eyes cold. "I'll explain it," she said, her voice cutting. She tossed a leather-bound journal onto the table, its pages yellowed. "Mother's diary. I found it last night. Read it." Lucas opened it, his hands unsteady, and Grace peered over his shoulder. The entry was dated 10 years back. Eleanor's handwriting faint but clear. "Met a girl today at the charity fair in Queens," it read. 17, shy, sketching a dress on scrap paper, roses everywhere. "I told her she had a gift, gave her my old silk swatch to start. She didn't know my name, but I'll never forget hers." "Grace," Lucas's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "You?" Grace's knees buckled, memories flooding back, a woman with kind eyes, a silk square pressed into her hand. I didn't know who she was," she whispered. "She just said to keep going." The room spun. Lucas stared at Grace, his mother's words bridging a gap he hadn't seen. "You met her," he said, his voice raw. "She saw you." Olivia cut in, her tone icy. "And now you're here, stealing her legacy. Convenient, isn't it?" Grace flinched, her voice rising. "I didn't steal anything. I didn't even know." Olivia smirked, stepping closer. "You expect us to believe that? You show up with her dress, worm your way in? I won't let you tarnish her name." Lucas turned on his sister, his eyes blazing. "Enough, Olivia. She's not lying. Look at her." Grace's hands shook, tears brimming. "I'm not here to take anything," she said, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to make something of my own." Lucas moved between them, facing Olivia. "She's not the enemy," he said, firm. "Mother saw something in her, and so do I." Olivia laughed, bitter. "You're blind, Lucas. She's using you." She stormed out, leaving the journal behind, its pages fluttering in the silence. Grace sank into a chair, her mind a mess. I didn't know, she said again, softer, staring at the photo. Lucas knelt beside her, his hand brushing hers, tentative but sure. I believe you, he said, his voice steady. And I don't care where it came from. I love what you made. I love... He stopped, the word hanging, but his eyes said it all. Grace looked at him, her heart pounding, caught between fear and a pull she couldn't deny. The dress wasn't just hers anymore. It was a thread tying her to a past she hadn't known, a woman who'd believed in her when no one else did, and now Lucas stood there, believing too, fighting for her in a way that broke her walls. Olivia's threat lingered, a storm brewing, but in that moment, it was just them, the journal open, the truth laid bare. Their bond had shifted, deepened by a secret neither saw coming. Grace wanted to pull back, to protect herself from this chaos, but Lucas wasn't letting her go, and the fight ahead would test them both. Grace Evans sat in the atelier, the journal of Eleanor Bennett open on the table, its pages a lifeline to a past she hadn't known she carried. Lucas knelt beside her, his hand warm against hers, his blue eyes steady with a belief that anchored her. Olivia's accusations still hung in the air, sharp and cold, but they faded under the weight of his gaze. I believe you, he'd said, and those words cracked something open in Grace, a wall she'd built from years of hiding. She wanted to speak, to push him away, but her throat tightened, and all she could do was look at him, caught in the pull of something she couldn't name. Lucas stood, pulling her up with him, his touch gentle but firm. Come with me, he said, his voice low, leading her out of the atelier and into the night. The city buzzed around them, but he took her to a quiet corner of the building, a rooftop garden he'd kept secret even from his team. The air was cool, the skyline glittering below, a crescent moon casting silver over rows of roses climbing the walls. Grace's breath caught, the beauty of it tugging at her. Why here? She asked, her voice soft. Lucas smiled, a rare softness breaking his usual edge. Because it's real. Like you. He pulled a sketch pad from a bench, handing it to her. Let's make something, he said, his eyes locked on hers. Together. Grace hesitated, her hands trembling, but the journal's words echoed in her mind. Eleanor's voice urging her to keep going. She nodded, sitting beside him, their shoulders brushing as they worked. Her pencil danced across the page, roses blooming again, but Lucas added his own lines, sharp and bold, a train that swept wide like a storm. They didn't speak, just drew, the silence thick with a rhythm they both felt. Hours slipped by, the city fading until it was just them, the sketch pad, and the night. When they finished, the gown on the page was a fusion of them, her softness and his strength, a dress that felt alive. Grace looked at it, then at him, her heart pounding. It's beautiful, she whispered, her voice breaking. Lucas set the pencil down, turning to her, his face close enough to feel his breath. You're beautiful, he said, his tone raw. I've been trying to figure out why I couldn't let you go since that night. It's not just the dress, Grace. It's you. I love you. The words hung there, heavy and true, and Grace's eyes filled with tears, not from pain, but from a warmth she'd never known. She shook her head, her voice trembling. You don't know what you're saying. I'm nobody. I'm just... Lucas cupped her face, stopping her. You're everything, he said, his thumbs brushing her cheeks. I saw you that night, and I've been falling ever since. I don't care where you came from. I care where you're going, and I want it to be with me. Grace's breath hitched, his touch searing through her doubts. She'd spent so long running, hiding, but here he was, seeing her, wanting her, and she couldn't fight it anymore. Their lips met under the moonlight, a kiss that started soft, tentative, then deepened with a hunger neither could hold back. Grace's hands slid up his chest, feeling his heartbeat under her palms, fast and alive. Lucas pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, the sketch pad forgotten as the roses around them swayed in the breeze. It was a moment of surrender, of truth, the world shrinking to just them, and the promise in that touch. When they parted, Grace's tears spilled over, and Lucas wiped them away, his forehead resting against hers. "I'm not letting you go," he whispered. "Not now, not ever." The next day, Lucas called a press conference. The atrium of Bennett Luxury packed with reporters and designers, Grace's sketches projected behind him. Olivia stood in the back, her arms crossed, her glare cutting through the crowd. Lucas took the podium, his voice steady. "There's been talk about our new collection," he said, his eyes finding Grace in the front row. "Talk about theft, about legacy. Here's the truth. My mother, Eleanor Bennett, saw a girl with a gift 10 years ago. She gave her a chance, a spark. That girl is Grace Evans, and she's no thief. She's a creator. This is her work, and it's ours." He held up the journal, reading Eleanor's words aloud, his voice breaking as he spoke of her belief in Grace. The room went silent, then erupted in murmurs, cameras flashing. Grace stood frozen, her hands clasped tight, tears brimming again. Lucas stepped down, walking to her, ignoring the chaos. "You're not alone in this," he said, loud enough for only her to hear. "I've got you." Olivia pushed through the crowd, her face twisted. "You're ruining us," she hissed at Lucas. "Mother's name deserves better." He turned to her, unflinching. "Mother would have loved her," he said, "and so do I." Olivia stormed out, her heels clicking, but Grace barely noticed, lost in Lucas's gaze. They went back to the atelier that night, the press conference fading into a hum. Grace picked up their shared sketch, her fingers tracing the lines they'd drawn together. "I never thought I'd have this," she said, her voice soft. "Someone who sees me." Lucas stood behind her, his arms slipping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "I'll always see you," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "Thank you for staying." Grace turned in his arms, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you for finding me," she said, and they kissed again, slower this time, a promise sealed under the atelier's soft lights. The dress they'd sketched lay between them, a symbol of what they'd built, not just fabric but a bond forged from chaos and truth. Olivia's shadow lingered, a fight they'd face later, but for now it was enough. Grace had stepped out of her shadows, and Lucas had found a heart he didn't know he'd lost. Their love was unfolding, raw and real, and nothing could pull them apart. Grace Evans and Lucas Bennett stood together in the aftermath of the press conference, the atelier's soft lights casting a glow over the dress they'd sketched that night on the rooftop. The world had shifted beneath them, Olivia's anger a distant echo, the journal's truth a bridge that held them steady. Grace leaned into Lucas, his arms around her, a warmth she'd never thought she'd claim, and for the first time, she let herself believe this could last. Their kiss lingered in the air, a vow unspoken but felt, and as the days turned to months, their love grew roots deeper than either had imagined. Time moved forward, carrying them with it. Grace's designs took flight under Bennett Luxury, her bridal collection a quiet storm that swept through showrooms and headlines. She stood on runways she'd once only sketched, her hazel eyes bright with a pride she'd earned. Lucas at her side, his hand in hers. He stepped back from the spotlight, letting her shine, but he was always there, his belief in her a constant thread. They fought, too, small clashes over late nights and stubborn choices, but each one ended with them closer, their bond forged in the fire of who they'd become together. Years later, they left the city's chaos behind, settling into a small house on Long Island, its porch lined with roses that reminded Grace of her sketches. The empire Lucas had built still thrived, but he'd sold most of his shares, trading boardrooms for something simpler, something real. Together, they opened a tiny boutique, Grace and Bennett, a place where every gown told a story, not of wealth but of heart. Grace designed each piece, her hands steady now, while Lucas handled the books, his sharp mind bent over numbers with a smile he'd never worn in Manhattan. One evening, Grace sat in the boutique, sunlight spilling through the windows, a bolt of white silk unrolled before her. She was older now, faint lines tracing her face, but her eyes still held that quiet fire. Lucas stepped in, his dark hair streaked with gray, carrying a tray of tea. Their daughter, Eleanor, named for the woman who'd tied their fates, played nearby, her small hands tugging at scraps of lace. She was 5, her laughter a song that filled the space, her dark curls bouncing as she ran to Grace. "Mommy, make me a dress," she said, and Grace laughed, pulling her close. "One day, Ellie, one day." Lucas set the tray down, sitting beside Grace, his arms slipping around her. "She's got your spirit," he said, his voice soft, watching Eleanor with a love that softened his edges. Grace smiled, leaning into him. "And your stubbornness." They sat in silence, the tea steaming, the boutique a haven they'd built from the ashes of their past. The dresses on the racks weren't just fabric, they were memories of that night he'd stumbled into her life, of the journal that bound them, of the love that grew from a single glance. Grace traced a finger over the silk, her thoughts drifting. "I never thought I'd have this," she said, her voice low. "A place, a family, you." Lucas turned to her, his blue eyes catching hers, steady as ever. "I never thought I'd find this," he said. "I had everything, but it was nothing until you." He took her hand, his thumb brushing her knuckles. "Mother would have loved you, Grace. She did love you, even then." Grace's throat tightened, Eleanor's name a whisper in her mind. A woman she'd met only once, but who'd shaped her more than she'd known. They stood, walking to the porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky gold. Eleanor ran ahead, chasing fireflies, her giggles floating back. Lucas pulled Grace close, his chin resting on her head. "No regrets?" she asked, her voice a murmur against his chest. He shook his head, his arms tightening. "None. You're my greatest win." Grace smiled, her hand resting over his heart. "And you're mine." The roses swayed in the breeze, their petals a quiet echo of the sketches that had brought them here. A legacy not of fame, but of love. The boutique grew, not into an empire, but a name whispered with warmth. Brides came from miles away, drawn by the stories woven into each gown, by the couple who made them with hands and hearts entwined. Eleanor grew too, her own sketches piling up. A new generation carrying the thread forward. Grace and Lucas watched her, knowing their love had built more than a business. It had built a home, a life, a mark that would outlast them. In the end, it wasn't about the dress that night, or the empire Lucas once ruled, or even the journal that tied their pasts. It was about them, 2 souls who'd found each other in the dark, who'd fought and fallen and risen together. Grace had stepped out of her shadows, and Lucas had found a heart to hold. Their legacy was Eleanor's laughter, the roses on the porch, the gowns that carried their story into the world. And as they stood there, the sun setting, they knew it was enough. Grace Evans and Lucas Bennett stood on their porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. Eleanor's laughter fading into the twilight, the roses around them a quiet testament to a love that had grown from a single chaotic night. Their story didn't end with fame or fortune, but with something deeper, a legacy stitched into every gown they made, every moment they shared. The dress that sparked it all, the one Lucas stumbled upon in that Brooklyn boutique, became more than fabric. It became a thread that wove their lives together, binding them through secrets, fights, and a love neither saw coming. Years had passed since that first glance, since Grace's sketches turned into dreams she could hold, since Lucas traded his empire for her hand. They'd built a life not of grandeur, but of heart. A small boutique where brides found their own stories, a daughter who carried their fire forward. Eleanor's gift had lit the way, a chance meeting Grace hadn't understood until Lucas brought it to light. And together, they'd turned it into something lasting. Their love wasn't perfect. It was real, forged in the clash of their worlds and the quiet of their nights, a love that stood the test of time. Now, as the stars blinked awake over Long Island, Grace rested against Lucas, his arms around her, their hands linked over a future they'd never imagined. This was their legacy, not in headlines or wealth, but in the laughter of their child, the beauty they created, the bond they'd never let break. It started with a dress, a mistake, a heartbeat, and it ended here, with them, together, whole. Their story's yours now, a whisper of what love can do when you let it in. What did it stir in you? Share your thoughts below and let's keep dreaming together.